She's not going anywhere. He stood between her and the town who wanted her gone. The winter of 1823 approached Blackridge Township like a wolf circling wounded prey. Already the autumn harvest had fallen short by nearly half, and the community's stores looked dangerously thin. In the cramped back room of Morrison's general store, 5 men gathered around a flickering oil lamp, their faces carved into harsh shadows. "We can't feed everyone," said Jeremiah Callahan, the town's self-appointed leader. His jowls trembled as he spoke, betraying the irony of a well-fed man declaring scarcity. "The mathematics are simple. Too many mouths, not enough grain." The other men nodded, though some with visible reluctance. There was Thomas Reed, the blacksmith, Samuel Morrison, who owned the store, Dr. Edwin Pierce, whose Hippocratic oath seemed to have exceptions, and lastly, Deputy Marshal Frank Dutton, whose badge gave their scheme the veneer of legality. "We need to make hard choices," Callahan continued, sliding a piece of paper across the scarred wooden table. "I've prepared a list. People who don't contribute their fair share." The list contained 23 names: the elderly, the infirm, the desperately poor. And there, near the bottom, written in Callahan's careful script, Louise Pritchard. "The orphan girl?" Morrison asked, his conscience pricking slightly. "She's young still, barely 25. "She's fat as a prize hog," Callahan replied coldly. "Eats more than she could ever give back. No family to speak for her, no husband to provide. She's a drain on our resources." What none of them mentioned, what hung unspoken in the tobacco-thick air, was that Louise had rejected Callahan's advances 2 years prior. He had offered to take her in as a housekeeper, a proposition that barely concealed more sinister intentions. When she'd politely but firmly refused, his benevolence had curdled into spite.
The decree went out the next morning, delivered by Deputy Dutton and 4 hired men. They went door to door, giving each person on the list 24 hours to vacate Blackridge Township. Most left quietly, having no strength or means to resist. The elderly widow Murphy wept. The crippled war veteran Jenkins cursed them, but packed his meager belongings. One by one, they disappeared into the wilderness, walking toward uncertain fates in neighboring settlements, if they could reach them before winter's teeth closed around the land. Louise was tending to sick children when they came for her. She lived in a small cabin at the edge of town, a structure she'd inherited from the couple who'd raised her until fever took them both. The cabin was humble but clean, its shelves lined with dried herbs, tinctures, and remedies she'd learned to prepare from the Cherokee woman who sometimes visited the settlement. Louise had no formal medical training, but she had something more valuable: a gentle touch, infinite patience, and an instinct for healing that Dr. Pierce, for all his purchased credentials, lacked. When the knock came, she was crushing fever-few leaves for young Timothy Holbrook's persistent headaches. His mother sat nearby, watching Louise work with grateful eyes. Deputy Dutton entered without waiting for invitation, his 4 companions filling the doorway behind him. "Louise Pritchard," he said, his voice mechanical, reciting words he'd been given. "By order of the Blackridge Council, you are hereby required to vacate this township within 24 hours. Failure to comply will result in forcible removal." The mortar and pestle fell from Louise's hands, clattering against the wooden floor. "What? I don't understand. This is my home." "Not anymore," one of the hired men said. He was a rough character named Briggs, brought in from another county specifically for this task.
"You got until tomorrow morning, then we drag you out." Mrs. Holbrook stood up, her face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. Louise has done nothing wrong." "Take it up with the council," Dutton replied. He avoided looking at Louise directly, a small mercy from a man who knew this was wrong but lacked the spine to say so. "Those are the orders." After they left, Louise sank onto her bed, trembling. Mrs. Holbrook tried to comfort her, but what comfort could there be? Louise had no horse, no wagon, barely any money. Where could she go? The nearest settlement was 40 miles east, through terrain that grew more dangerous with each passing day, as bandits and desperate men prowled the wilderness. She was still sitting there an hour later, staring at nothing, when she heard the shouting outside. "She's not going anywhere." The voice came from the yard, deep and resonant, carrying the kind of authority that made men pause. Louise rushed to the window and saw Nathan Coulter, standing between her cabin and the 5 men who'd delivered the decree. Nathan was a mountain man, a former Army scout who'd fought in the War of 1812 and had the scars to prove it. He'd been living in Blackridge for nearly 3 years, keeping mostly to himself, trapping and hunting in the surrounding wilderness. He was tall and lean, with dark hair shot through with premature silver and eyes the color of winter ice. Most people in town gave him a wide berth, uncertain how to categorize a man who seemed equally comfortable in civilization and the wild. "This doesn't concern you, Coulter," Dutton said, though his voice lacked conviction. "When a town decides to throw a woman out to die in the wilderness, it concerns every decent person," Nathan replied. His hand rested casually on the knife at his belt. Not a threat, just a reminder. "This is wrong, and you know it." Briggs stepped forward, his face twisted with contempt.
"She's useless, fat and useless. We can't afford dead weight." Nathan's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Useless? This woman has saved more lives in this town than your council ever has. Who sat up 3 nights straight with Callahan's own niece when scarlet fever almost took her? Who made the poultice that saved Morrison's wife's leg from infection? Who teaches the children their letters when she could be resting?" "Pretty speech," Briggs sneered, "but orders are orders. Step aside." No. The single word hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. "If you want her out," Nathan continued, his voice dropping to something colder and more lethal, "you'll have to go through me first. And boys, I promise you that'll cost more than you're willing to pay." Briggs reached for his knife, and the confrontation might have turned bloody right then. But something unexpected happened. Doors began opening. Windows slid up. People started emerging from their homes. Mrs. Holbrook was first, standing with her arms crossed. "Louise saved my Timothy. She stays." Then came old Jacob Sanders, the veteran everyone thought had no fight left in him. "She brought me food last winter when I was starving. Didn't ask for nothing in return. She stays." Martha Green, the seamstress. "She delivered my baby when the doctor was drunk. She stays." One by one, they came. 30 voices, 40. People Louise had helped, people she'd comforted, people who'd forgotten her kindness until this moment forced them to remember. Dutton looked around, reading the crowd's mood. He might have a badge, but he didn't have enough bullets, and he knew it. "This isn't over," he said finally, signaling his men to retreat. "Callahan will hear about this." As the crowd dispersed, Nathan turned to find Louise standing in her doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Why?" she whispered. "You barely know me." Nathan was quiet for a moment, studying her with those ice-blue eyes. "I know enough," he said finally. "I know you're the only person in this town who ever asked me if I was all right after I came back from the war. Most people just saw the scars and the silence and stayed away. You saw a person who might need help." Louise remembered that day. She'd brought him elderberry syrup for a persistent cough, nothing more. She hadn't realized he'd noticed. "They'll come back," Nathan continued, his voice practical now. "Callahan doesn't like being challenged, especially in front of the whole town. You need somewhere safer than this cabin." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "I have a place up in the foothills. It's rough, but it's defensible. You'd be welcome there, at least until this blows over. I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition if I'm offering." He smiled then, a rare expression that softened his weathered face. "Besides, I could use the company. Winter's long when you're alone." Louise hesitated. Propriety suggested she should refuse, but propriety had just tried to send her into the wilderness to die. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you, Nathan." "Don't thank me yet," he replied. "The cabin's a mess, and I'm not much for conversation. But you'll be safe. That's something." They left at dawn, before the town fully woke. Nathan's cabin was a 2-hour ride up into the pine-covered hills, perched on an outcropping that overlooked a small valley. It was, as he'd warned, rough one-room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, and shuttered windows that could be barred from inside. But it was solid, built to withstand both winter storms and human threats. The first week was awkward, filled with the careful politeness of strangers sharing close quarters. Nathan gave Louise the loft and made himself a bedroll near the fire. He rose before dawn to check his trap lines, returning with rabbits, a few beaver pelts, and once, miraculously, a young deer. Louise cooked, cleaned, and organized his chaotic collection of supplies with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. "You had a system?" she asked one evening, examining his previous method of storage, essentially, throwing things wherever they might land. "I had an idea of where things were," he replied defensively. She didn't argue, just continued labeling jars and arranging his meager spice collection in alphabetical order. But gradually, the ice between them thawed. Nathan discovered that Louise, despite everything she'd endured, possessed a wry humor that caught him off guard. When he came home soaked from an unexpected storm, she draped a blanket over his shoulders and remarked, "You know, most people come inside when it rains." "I noticed the rain after I was already wet," he'd muttered. "Observant. That must have served you well in the army." He'd laughed, then actually laughed, and couldn't remember the last time he'd done that. Louise, for her part, discovered layers beneath Nathan's gruff exterior. He was surprisingly well-read, with a collection of water-stained books he'd accumulated over the years. Shakespeare, Franklin, even some Greek philosophy translated into English. He'd taught himself to read during his army years, and books had been his companions through long, lonely winters. "Why didn't you ever marry?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Nathan carving a new handle for his skinning knife while she mended his spare shirt. The question hung between them for a long moment. "I did," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Her name was Sarah. We married young, before the war. She died of typhoid while I was away fighting the British. Got the letter 3 months after she'd been buried. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago," but the way he said it suggested the wound had never quite healed. "What about you? Never had suitors?" Louise's laugh was bitter. "Men don't court women who look like me, Nathan. They either ignore me completely or assume I'm desperate enough to accept unacceptable arrangements." She didn't elaborate, but he understood. "Their loss," he said simply, and meant it. As October bled into November, their partnership deepened into something neither had quite anticipated. Nathan taught Louise to shoot his spare rifle, patiently correcting her stance and aim until she could hit a target at 30 yards. "Living out here, you need to know how to protect yourself," he explained. "I won't always be around." Louise taught him the medicinal properties of plants, showing him how to identify useful herbs even in late autumn. "This is yarrow," she'd say, crouching beside a withered plant. "Stops bleeding. This is wild ginger, good for stomach ailments. And this," she'd hold up a dried root, "is golden seal, worth more than gold if you know how to use it." They fell into rhythms, Nathan chopping wood while Louise prepared breakfast, both of them working on projects by firelight in the evening, the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that events in Black Ridge were spiraling beyond their control. Jeremiah Callahan had not taken his public humiliation well. The fact that 40 townspeople had sided against him gnawed at his pride like a festering wound. But more than that, he'd realized something troubling. If people could successfully challenge his authority once, they might do so again. The entire social order he'd carefully constructed with himself at the top was suddenly vulnerable. So he'd begun spreading rumors. Louise Pritchard was a witch, he whispered, who'd enchanted Nathan Coulter with dark magic. How else could a woman like that convince a war hero to defend her? The herbs she used for medicine, weren't they really components of spells? And all those people she'd helped, hadn't some of them fallen mysteriously ill in the first place? The rumors found fertile ground in superstition and fear. By December, half the town believed Louise was practicing witchcraft, and the other half was uncertain enough not to argue too loudly. Callahan wasn't done. He'd sent word to his brother-in-law, a federal marshal based 3 territories over, describing a dangerous fugitive hiding in the mountains near Black Ridge. He provided an entirely fictional account of crimes: theft, poisoning, sedition. The marshal, trusting his relation and eager to make his quota of arrests before year's end, assembled a posse. They rode for Black Ridge in mid-December, 6 armed men with a warrant and bad intentions. Nathan learned of their coming from an unexpected source, Deputy Dutton. The deputy rode out to the cabin one bitter morning, his face haggard with guilt. "They're coming," he said without preamble. "Federal posse. Callahan convinced them Louise is a criminal. They'll be here in 2 days, maybe less." Nathan's face remained impassive, but Louise, listening from inside, felt her blood turn to ice water. "Dutton, why are you telling us this?" Nathan asked carefully. The deputy wouldn't meet his eyes. "Because this has gone too far. Because I've got daughters, and I keep thinking, what if someone did this to them? I'm not brave enough to stand up to Callahan, but I can at least give you warning." He paused. "If you run now, you might make it to the territorial line before they catch up." After Dutton left, Nathan and Louise sat in stunned silence. "I should go alone," Louise said finally. "There's no reason for you to—" "No." Nathan's voice was flat, brooking no argument. "We go together, or we don't go at all. Nathan, they'll arrest you for harboring a fugitive. You could hang." "Then we'd better make sure they don't catch us." He was already moving, pulling down packs, sorting supplies. "We head west, toward the mountain passes. There are caves, I know, places a posse won't find easily. We hole up there until spring, then cross into the next territory. Start fresh somewhere they've never heard of Jeremiah Callahan." "This is insane." "Probably." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "But I'm not letting them take you, not for Callahan's lies, not for anything." Something in his expression made Louise's heart hammer against her ribs. This wasn't just about justice anymore. Something had shifted between them during those months in the cabin, something neither had been willing to name. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you risking everything for me?" Nathan crossed the cabin in 3 strides, taking her hands in his. They were rough and scarred, the hands of a man who'd lived hard, but they held hers with extraordinary gentleness. "Because somewhere between teaching you to shoot and you reorganizing my entire life," he said softly, "I fell in love with you. Because when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is whether you're warm enough. Because your laugh is the best sound I've ever heard. Because you're brave and kind and brilliant, and if the world can't see that, then the world's a fool." He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "Because you're not going anywhere without me. Not now, not ever, if you'll have me." Tears spilled down Louise's cheeks. "I'm not easy to love, Nathan. I'm not what men want." "You're everything I want," he interrupted firmly. "Everything I didn't know I needed until I found it." She kissed him then, pulling him down to her level, and it was nothing like the romantic stories she'd read as a girl. It was desperate and fierce and tasted like salt tears and hope, and it was perfect. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathan pressed his forehead to hers. "We should probably still run for our lives," he said wryly. Louise laughed, the sound breaking through her tears. Practical as always. "Someone has to be around here." They packed through the night, taking only what they could carry. Weapons, food, warm clothes, Louise's precious medical supplies. Nathan buried his books under the cabin floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth. "We'll come back for them," he promised, "when it's safe." At dawn, they started west, into the mountains. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Louise's life. They traveled through terrain that grew increasingly hostile, following paths only Nathan knew, staying ahead of the posse by mere hours. Twice they heard dogs barking in the distance. Once they glimpsed riders on a ridge behind them. Nathan led them higher into the mountains, toward passes that were already thick with snow. "They won't follow us much farther," he said. "Not this late in the season. Too dangerous." But he'd underestimated Callahan's influence and the marshal's determination. The posse pressed on, driven by promises of reward money and the stubborn refusal to admit defeat. Finally, in a narrow canyon, where the walls rose like cathedral stone on either side, they were cornered. 6 men blocked the path ahead. Behind them, Nathan heard horses approaching from the rear. They'd been herded here deliberately. He realized the posse had split up, using his own wilderness knowledge against him. "Nathan Coulter," the marshal called out. "Federal Marshal Tucker. We're here for the woman. Surrender her peacefully, and you'll only face charges of obstruction." "She's innocent," Nathan called back. "Those charges are fabricated by a man with a grudge." "That's not for you to decide. We have a warrant, legal and binding." Nathan glanced at Louise, saw the fear in her eyes, but also something else, determination. They'd come too far to surrender now. "We're not going back," Nathan shouted. He raised his rifle, not aiming at anyone specifically, just making his position clear. The canyon erupted into chaos. Nathan pushed Louise behind a boulder, firing shots that echoed off the stone walls like thunder. The posse returned fire, but Nathan had the advantage of cover and superior positioning. He picked off 2 horses, sending their riders scrambling for cover. He wasn't trying to kill anyone just by time, but time for what? They were trapped. Then Louise did something unexpected. While Nathan kept the posse occupied, She began climbing the canyon wall using handholds and ledges that were barely there. Nathan spotted her movement and nearly shouted, but understanding dawned. If she could reach the top, she could escape while he held their attention. "Louise, no!" he hissed, but she was already 20 feet up, her fingers finding purchase in impossible places. She climbed with desperate strength, ignoring the burning in her arms, the terror that turned her bowels to water. Below, Nathan was running out of ammunition. She could hear him shouting something, but the wind snatched his words away. Almost there, just 10 more feet. Her hand slipped. She caught herself, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. Below, one of the posse members spotted her. "She's climbing!" Shots ricocheted off the stone inches from her head. Nathan roared something incoherent, providing covering fire that forced the posse to duck. Louise found a final handhold and hauled herself over the canyon's rim, collapsing onto solid ground. "Go!" Nathan shouted from below. "Louise, run!" But she couldn't leave him. Looking around frantically, she spotted large rocks near the canyon edge. With strength born of desperation, she began pushing them over, creating a small avalanche that sent the posse scrambling backward. In the confusion, Nathan made his own climb, abandoning his position and scaling the wall with the ease of a man who'd spent years in the wilderness. The posse fired at him, but their shots went wild. Within minutes, he joined Louise on the rim. They ran. Behind them, they heard Marshal Tucker shouting orders, but the posse would need time to find another way up, time Nathan and Louise didn't waste. They ran through the snow, through the gathering darkness, through terrain that should have been impossible. Louise's lungs burned, her legs screamed in protest, but Nathan's hand was locked around hers, pulling her forward. Finally, when even Nathan's iron endurance was failing, they found it, a cave entrance concealed behind a frozen waterfall. Nathan had to break through ice to reach it, but inside they found shelter, a space deep enough to hide them, with a narrow chimney that would disperse smoke from a small fire. They collapsed together, gasping for breath, alive against all odds. They stayed in the cave for 3 weeks. Outside, winter raged with a fury that made pursuit impossible. The posse, wherever they were, had either turned back or frozen to death trying to continue. Nathan ventured out occasionally during clear spells, checking their back trail, hunting when possible. Mostly, they survived on dried meat and melted snow. But survival wasn't just physical. In that cave, lit by firelight that danced shadows across stone walls, something deeper took root between them. They talked, really talked, in the way people do when they have nothing but time and each other. Nathan told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about joining the army to escape poverty, about the things he'd seen in the war that still haunted him. Louise told him about being orphaned at 12, about learning to read from a traveling preacher, about the loneliness of being different in a world that valued conformity. "I used to pray to be thin," she admitted one night, her voice soft. "I thought if I could just look like other women, everything would be different. Men would court me, the town would respect me, I'd finally belong." "And now?" Nathan asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "Now I think maybe the problem was never me. Maybe the problem was everyone else's inability to see past surfaces." She looked at him. "You saw me, not my body me, the person inside. Do you know how rare that is?" Nathan pulled her closer, wrapping them both in the thick bear skin that served as their blanket. The world's full of fools. Their blindness is my good fortune. They made love for the first time in that cave, with the wind howling outside and ice coating the entrance. It was tender and awkward and perfect, their bodies learning each other's rhythms, their whispered words more precious than poetry. Afterward, lying tangled together, Nathan said the words that had been building in his chest for months. "Marry me?" Louise lifted her head, studying his face in the firelight. "We're fugitives in a cave, wanted by the law, with no future to speak of. You really want to propose now?" "Especially now." His hand cupped her face. "Because none of the rest matters. The law, the town, Callahan, all of it fades away, and what's left is us. That's all I care about. So marry me. We'll say the vows here, with God and the wilderness as witnesses. We'll make it legal later, when we can, but the commitment that starts now." She kissed him, tasting salt tears, hers or his, she wasn't sure. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They spoke their vows that night, with only each other to hear. Nathan produced a thin gold ring he'd carried since his first wife's death, a talisman he'd never been able to let go. "Sarah would want you to have it," he said, sliding it onto Louise's finger. "She'd want me to be happy again, to find someone worthy of love." He paused. "And you are worthy, Louise, of love, of respect, of everything good this world has to offer." Louise wore that ring with more pride than if it had been studded with diamonds. Spring came late that year, and with it, revelation. They emerged from their winter exile in April, descending from the mountains cautiously, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. But something had changed in their absence. Black Ridge was in turmoil. The same federal marshal who chased them into the mountains had returned not with a posse this time, but with questions. During the winter, confined to the settlement, Marshal Tucker had started investigating the charges against Louise Pritchard. What he'd found troubled him deeply. Every witness Callahan had cited turned out to be either coerced or paid. The theft was goods Louise had been given freely by grateful patients. The poisonings were either false or illnesses that had occurred before Louise's interventions. The entire case was fabrication from beginning to end. More damning still, Deputy Dutton had finally grown a spine. Consumed by guilt over his role in the persecution, he'd confessed everything to the marshal: the decree to exile the vulnerable, Callahan's personal vendetta, the manufactured charges. Other townspeople, their courage bolstered by Dutton's confession, came forward with their own testimonies. By March, Jeremiah Callahan and his counsel had been arrested on charges of conspiracy, false imprisonment, and attempted murder. The judge who'd reviewed the case had been scandalized. Even in the rough frontier of the 1820s, there were lines civilized men didn't cross. Nathan and Louise learned all this from a most unexpected source: Thomas Reed, the blacksmith who'd been part of the original council. He rode out to meet them on the trail, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "The charges are dropped," he said without preamble. "All of them. The marshal wants to apologize in person. The town—" He paused, struggling with words. "The town is ashamed. We want you to come back." Nathan's hand tightened on his rifle. "Why should we trust anything you people say?" "Because Callahan and the others are in chains, awaiting transport to a territorial prison. Because we held elections, and the new council's first act was to issue a formal apology." Reed's weathered face showed genuine remorse. We let fear and prejudice guide us. We listened to a cruel man and turned our backs on someone who'd only ever helped us. That's not the kind of town we want to be." Louise stepped forward. "What happened to the others? The people on the list?" Reed's expression darkened. "3 didn't make it through the winter. Old Widow Murphy, the Jenkins veteran, and a young mother named Sarah Ross. Their deaths are on our conscience." He looked directly at Louise. "We can't undo what was done, but we can do better going forward, if you'll let us try." Nathan looked at Louise, letting her make the decision. After all, this was her home, or had been. "I'll come back," she said finally, "but not to live. I'm building a life with Nathan now up in the mountains. That's where we belong." She paused. "But I'll visit. I'll help when I'm needed. And if the town truly wants to change, if you want to honor the people who died, you'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again." "You have my word," Reed said. "All of our words." They returned to Black Ridge cautiously, but the reception surprised them. Nearly the entire town turned out, many people openly weeping as they apologized. Mrs. Holbrook brought Timothy, now recovered from his fever and healthy. Martha Green presented Louise with a beautiful quilt she'd made depicting the cabin in the mountains, stitched with care and gratitude. Marshall Tucker apologized personally, admitting he'd let zeal override judgment. "I should have investigated before pursuing," he said. "That mistake almost cost innocent lives." The new council offered Nathan and Louise compensation money, land, supplies. They accepted only enough to rebuild their lives, refusing anything more. "We don't need charity," Nathan said, "just fairness going forward." They were married again, this time in a proper ceremony with the whole town in attendance. The new minister, a young man named Ellis, who actually believed his own sermons about compassion, performed the service with genuine warmth. Louise wore a dress Martha Green had altered for her, not trying to hide her body, just celebrating it. She was beautiful in the spring sunlight, radiant with happiness, and Nathan told her so a dozen times. After the ceremony, as they prepared to return to their mountain home, old Jacob Sanders approached. He carried a wooden box, carefully carved. "Made this for you," he said gruffly, presenting it to Louise. "It's seeds, medical herbs, vegetables, flowers, for your garden up there. Figure you'll need them." Louise accepted the gift with tears in her eyes. One by one, others came forward with their own offerings: tools, books, fabric, preserved foods, not bribes or payment, but genuine gifts from grateful hearts. They left Black Ridge that evening with a wagon full of supplies and hearts full of hope. The years that followed were among the happiest of their lives. Nathan expanded the cabin, adding a second room and a proper surgery space where Louise could treat patients. Word spread beyond Black Ridge that a skilled healer lived in the mountains, and people began making the journey to seek her help. Louise never turned anyone away, regardless of their ability to pay. Nathan trapped and hunted, selling furs that brought in steady income. But more than that, he found peace. The demons from his war years gradually quieted, their voices dimmed by love and purpose. He was no longer alone in the wilderness. He was building something with someone he cherished. They visited Black Ridge regularly, and Louise established a small clinic in town where she worked 2 days each month. The arrangement satisfied everyone. The townspeople got access to quality care, and Louise maintained her independence. In their 3rd year together, Louise became pregnant. The news terrified Nathan. So much could go wrong, especially this far from proper medical care. But Louise, with her healer's knowledge, navigated the pregnancy with calm confidence. She taught Nathan everything he'd need to know to assist her. And though he was nervous enough to be sick himself, he learned. Their daughter was born on a snowy December morning, arriving with a lusty cry that announced her displeasure at the cold world. They named her Sarah, after Nathan's first wife, a gesture Louise insisted on, honoring the past while celebrating the present. "Sarah would have liked you," Nathan told Louise as they watched their daughter sleep. "She'd have been glad I found love again. Found you." 2 years later came a son, whom they named Jacob, after the old veteran who'd been killed in the expulsion. "So his name lives on," Louise said, "so people remember." The children grew up wild and free in the mountains, learning to track from their father and to heal from their mother. Sarah proved to have her mother's gift for medicine and her father's steel spine. Jacob had his father's quiet nature and his mother's gentle heart. 20 years passed. Black Ridge had grown into a thriving settlement, now officially incorporated as a town. The events of 1823 had become local legend, a cautionary tale about prejudice and fear, but also a story of redemption. The clinic Louise had established had expanded into a proper hospital, run by young doctors she'd trained. Dr. Pierce, the physician who'd been part of Callahan's council, had spent his remaining years atoning for his sins, working alongside Louise without pay until his death. His final words, whispered to Louise as she held his hand, were, "Thank you for showing me what healing really means." Deputy Dutton had become sheriff after Marshal Tucker retired, and he'd proven himself worthy of the badge fare, honest, and unafraid to stand up for what was right, even when it was unpopular. Thomas Reed, the blacksmith, had taken over as mayor and ran the town with steady competence. He'd commissioned a memorial stone placed in the town square bearing the names of those who died during the expulsion. Let us never forget, let us never repeat. Nathan and Louise, now in their late 40s, had become something of a legend themselves. People spoke in hushed, respectful tones of the mountain couple who'd stood against injustice, who'd survived impossible odds, who'd built a life of meaning from the ashes of cruelty. Their cabin had grown into a small compound with additional buildings for visitors and patients who needed extended care. Sarah, now 18, had already surpassed her mother's medical knowledge and was considering traveling east for formal training. Jacob, 16, had his father's way with the wilderness and was already the best tracker in 3 territories. One evening, as Nathan and Louise sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, she leaned against his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up the quiet life you had before, taking on my troubles?" Nathan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. After 20 years, she still fit perfectly against him. "Every morning I wake up next to you, I thank whatever gods might be listening that Callahan was stupid enough to try to drive you away. If he hadn't, I might never have worked up the courage to speak to you properly." "You would have," Louise said with certainty. "Eventually." "Maybe." He kissed the top of her head. "But this way makes for a better story." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars emerged one by one like promises kept. Inside the cabin, Sarah was teaching a young patient how to make a poultice while Jacob prepared dinner, their voices drifting out into the evening air. The sound of their children's laughter, of a home filled with purpose and love, was the sweetest music Nathan had ever heard. Louise's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his rough, scarred hands that had built this life together, one difficult choice at a time. "She's not going anywhere," Louise murmured, echoing the words Nathan had spoken so long ago, that frozen morning when he'd stood between her and an unjust world. Nathan smiled in the darkness. "Neither am I." And they weren't. They stayed in those mountains for the rest of their lives, growing old together, training healers, raising children, and proving every day that a person's worth isn't measured by appearance or the opinions of small-minded people, but by the depth of their compassion and the strength of their character. The story of Nathan and Louise became a touchstone for the region, told to children as they learned about justice, shared among adults as they faced their own moral crossroads, remembered by communities as they built new futures. And somewhere in the mountains above Black Ridge, if you knew where to look, you could find a thriving homestead where healing happened, where love endured, and where two people who'd been rejected by the world had created their own world, instead one built on acceptance, courage, and the revolutionary act of seeing each other truly. The cabin still stands today, maintained by descendants who understand its significance. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the pines, locals swear you can still hear it, the echo of a voice that once declared with absolute certainty, "She's not going anywhere," and meant it with every fiber of his being.